could you please introduce again briefly Professor Crane, please, so that we can record it in a proper way. So thank you.
Okay. Tá gravando, pode seguir.
So I received the message saying that it started already recording. Is that good for all of you too? Okay, so now it's perfect, Professor. Sorry.
I start?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Victoria, for the introduction. Thank you, Zhao, and your team for the invitation to be here today, talking about modern slavery, and in particular the business of modern slavery. And you know, it's an issue where we all know it's a terrible human rights violation when people are put into these kind of extreme forms of exploitation. But what I want to talk about today is the idea that it's also part of a business strategy, that it's an integral part of business models, both in terms of slavery enterprises that may engage in modern slavery, as well as the broader business models of multinational corporations, which may be connected to modern slavery practices through their supply chains. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the research that I've been doing around this topic, and also to share some findings that have come out, not from myself, but from colleagues, looking at what in particular has been happening around the business of modern slavery in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic and the broader world of work. So that's the general kind of idea of the talk today. And I thought it would be sensible to start off with this just question, to answer this question of what is modern slavery. I think we all know instinctively what it is, you know, that it's about people in situations of kind of extreme exploitation, that in some way they can't leave, right? They're having their freedom restricted. There's restrictions on them leaving, which might be through force or violence. But, you know, there's lots of exploitation that goes on in the world. So what makes modern slavery distinctive, if we can make it distinctive from other forms of exploitation? And the best we've got really is this kind of definition from the League of Nations, which is part of international law, which talks about modern slavery as being the exercise of any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership. So what this means is that modern slavery is like old slavery. It's like traditional slavery. It's like being owned by somebody else, but without necessarily the legal rights of ownership. Since we have abolished slavery now, it's much less possible to have a legal right of ownership of another human being, but you can still act as if you own somebody. Right? You can have the powers that is like you own somebody, and it's acting on these powers in terms of how you exploit somebody that constitutes modern slavery. So what does this mean in practice? So this exercise of the powers attaching to the right of ownership. So it's about control. That's the key characteristic, right? That somebody is in control of somebody else in such a way as to deprive that person of his or her individual liberty with the intent of exploitation, usually through means such as violent force, deception, and coercion. So that just gives us a flavor of what we're talking about, and try, you know, it's very hard to draw clear lines between exploitation, severe exploitation, the worst forms of exploitation, and something we might characterize as modern slavery. You know, it's a continuum. But here we're talking about, you know, when it gets really bad is when somebody has direct control over somebody and they can't leave because of the use of force or deception or something like that. So that gives us a sense, and then, you know, the question then that many people have, well, how many people are in these situations? And the data are rudimentary, right? They're not sophisticated data in terms of our estimates of how many people are in modern slavery. But these are some of the best estimates that are out there. This is from what's called the Global Slavery Index, which every couple of years comes up with a new estimate for how many people are in slavery in different countries around the world. And this map here shows how many people are, how many people are enslaved, or the prevalence of enslavement in different parts of the world. So you see that the parts on the map here, which are in a deep red color, are where there's the highest prevalence. That means there's more people as a proportion of the population are in some form of enslavement. And you can see that some of these are located in Africa, in the Middle East, and Asia. And then you have lower prevalence in some parts of the world, and then a kind of more of a mid-range in others where it gets to be orange. And you can see that Brazil here, since we're talking in Brazil today, is at a relatively low level, which might be fairly similar to parts of Europe. And this, I think, is partly a result of strong attention to trying to eradicate modern slavery in Brazil over the past couple of decades. But that's a prevalence. So it doesn't necessarily account for the kind of absolute numbers of people in these types of situations. And so according to the estimates, the absolute numbers of people, the highest numbers of people are in India. So even though it doesn't have the highest prevalence, it has by far the largest number of people. Millions of people are in some kind of modern slavery situation, followed by China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. And you can see that with some of these countries, at least, there's a correlation between the number of people in these situations and the degree of democracy in the country. So many of these are authoritarian countries, autocratic countries, but somewhere like India obviously is a democracy, so it doesn't necessarily correlate like that. And then, you know, the question of how many in total then are in these type of situations, the current estimate is somewhere around 40 million people. But as I say, these are very rough estimates. We know it's some millions. We don't really know how many millions, but this is the best estimate around. But you know, you couldn't really say that it's an accurate one. So what does that mean in terms of the products that we all use in the global marketplace? And if you can see this graph also from the Global Slavery Index, what it shows is the kinds of products that are most at risk of having slavery in their production, and which countries are exporting more of these, are importing the greater proportion of these at-risk products. And the types of products that are at the highest risk are electronics. So we have laptops, computers, and mobile phones. You see there at number 1, followed by garments, and then different food products such as fish, cocoa, and sugarcane. So I often say, you know, that if you have a phone or a computer, if you wear clothes, and if you eat food, there's a very good chance that you will have made use of slavery in the products that you use. So we're all in some way complicit in this situation of enabling modern slavery to take place, because it's there in our mobile phones, in the computer that you're watching this on, it's there in the food we're going to have for dinner tonight. And so this is a serious problem that we need to kind of unearth what's going on in these supply chains to try and figure out why this is happening and what we can do about it. And as you can see here on the graph, it also then estimates which countries are importing the largest number of these kind of products. And as you can see, the United States is by far the highest risk of being tainted by modern slavery, followed by many other developed countries. And you can see Brazil there, somewhere along at 3 billion worth of products are at risk of modern slavery. Again, it's a rough estimate, but it gives you some sense of what the scale of the problem might be. So it is a business, right? This is central to much of contemporary business, that it's embedded in many of the products that we buy on a day-to-day level. And so what I've been trying to do over the past 10 years or so is engage in a series of research projects around this business and modern slavery problem, which ranges from, on the left there, you see the kind of regulation and governance of modern slavery. So Victoria, you were talking about the UK Modern Slavery Act before. This is one of the things that we're looking at. To what effects does it have on preventing modern slavery? Similarly, work such as being done in Brazil and other countries, is useful to look at to see its effectiveness and to evaluate whether it should be replicated in other countries. Also, it's not just government regulation. There's obviously a lot of business activity, business type of governance, self-regulation that happens as companies try and enforce rules through their supply chains. And that supply chain aspect going through here on the picture is a key aspect of trying to understand the business of modern slavery. What I'm going to talk about a bit more today is some of the strategies and management of modern slavery, understanding it specifically as a business model. But then I've also done research on looking at the consumer end of things and also on how companies report on what they're doing and account for their activities in relation to modern slavery. We can talk perhaps about some of these in the Q&A at the end. So let me talk about this kind of part in the middle, the strategies and management of modern slavery. So according to a 2014 United Nations report, modern slavery is a $150 billion a year business, right? It's a massive part of the global economy, whether that's in legal products, such as the computers and food and stuff that we talked about, or also in illegal industries such as drugs and commercial sex work. We know that it's an essential part of many of these different businesses, and that a large amount of profitability is derived from it by some actors in these supply chains. And Kevin Bales, who's one of the best known commentators on modern slavery, he argued, in one of his early works, that the business of modern slavery is very different from the business of old slavery in important ways. First of all, the ownership is very different, right? In the past, you would buy a slave and, if we think about the transatlantic slave trade, you would buy a slave and keep that slave for 20, 30 years whilst they were still productively useful. You would make investments to make sure the slave stayed alive, and you would want to kind of reap the benefits of your ownership of that person over the course of their life. And so you'd be investing in their productivity in some ways. The cost is very different though now, because the ownership is very different now in that people don't have this kind of legal ownership. And the cost is very different because there are no markets for slaves in the same way as there once were. They're held onto for much shorter length of time. And the cost has declined rapidly. This is just one figure from Kevin's book, that the average price of a slave in 1809, adjusted to today's value, was $40,000 compared to $90 in 2009 when he did this estimate. So you can see a huge change in the economics of operating a slavery business as a result of this. But actually the whole business of modern slavery is quite poorly understood, and there's not been too much research on it. And so that's why I've been focusing on this over the last few years. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about one project that we did that sought to explore whether this emergence of modern slavery had been accompanied by innovations in how the business models of slavery worked. So we were comparing modern forms of slavery to more traditional forms of slavery, and understanding, are the business models in some ways different? And to put this into some kind of context, we need to think about which type of companies or enterprises we're talking about. So when we talk about the business of modern slavery, we often think about what's on the right-hand side here, which is the multinational corporations, right? What is it that they're doing? Those are the ones that are liable to things like the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. These are the ones that get all the attention. What are these big companies doing that are building these computers, selling us these phones, designing these clothes that we wear? But actually where modern slavery takes place is not in typically those multinational corporations themselves. It happens somewhere else, down through a supply chain. And so what we call in our work the modern slavery enterprises are different organizations. And it's these organizations that we tend not to understand very well. How do they operate? And so that's what we tried to do. A research project was to try and get a sense of how they operated and what their business models were. Not so much the business models of the multinationals, because I think we have a fairly good understanding of those, but the business models of modern slavery enterprises themselves. So here's what we found. This is our little framework that we developed as a result of this, and we published it in a paper earlier in the year. And basically what we tried to do here is to show that there are different ways that companies make money or enterprises make money from modern slavery for those enterprises that are actually deploying slavery practices, right? Where it's an essential part of their business model. And some of the important ways to think about these is to think about, okay, what type of company is it? Is it what we call here on the y-axis? Is it a producer? So is it is it a factory? Is it a farm? Is it a construction company? Is it like in the slavery of old, is it the plantation owner? Is it the one that's actually doing the production that is holding and utilizing slavery? Or is it an intermediary? Is it the slave trader, the trafficker, the person that's the intermediary that actually keeps hold of the control and effective ownership of people? And is that person or that organization the one that is actually engaged in slavery? So these are labor market intermediaries, right? We have a range of different names for them, from kind of agents to gangmasters and all kinds of other names. You probably have a name in Brazilian for these sorts of people that gather workers together to go and work somewhere. But rather than just leave them there, they carry on keeping them under their control. So there are different business models for these two types of enterprises. And then on the x-axis here, we've got the different ways in which they make money from modern slavery. And although slavery is all about, in many ways, reducing your labor costs, clearly, right? That's the key aspect of it. What we found with this work was there's many other reasons from a business point of view why companies may engage in modern slavery. So we looked at other forms of cost minimization, and we looked at, actually, sometimes this is used to generate additional revenue. So I'm just going to talk about a couple, just to give you a flavor of what this was about. So one is about reducing risks. So in our bottom left quadrant here. So for producers, very often producers might be involved in illegal activities, right? So we looked at the drugs industry in the UK, about cannabis cultivation. And what we found was there was a lot of slavery type practices being used in the cannabis industry. So we did all this work in the UK, right? Just in kind of industries such as drugs, in construction and agriculture. But in the drugs industry, we found that there was lots of use of forced labor, which is quite strange. If you know anything about the business of the illegal drug trade, you don't normally have much forced labor involved. It's typically people voluntarily join it and they don't get paid very much. There's a pretty high risk of them getting killed or injured, but still people voluntarily enter into the drugs industry. So we thought, why would people be involved in this? Why would they have to force people into it? And what we discovered was that the reason different drugs companies were using forced labor was not so much to reduce their labor costs, but actually was to reduce their risks of being caught. That when you have forced labor, you can lock people in and they're growing the cannabis. Then you can have people who have no documentation, who are in fear of their lives, who are never going to report on you because you have control over them. And if you have that control over people, you have protection when they get arrested for your business. And we also found that even in legitimate businesses that are not involved in drugs or the sex industry, they would often be involved in fairly unethical or illegal practices. And sometimes to hide those illegal practices, like they were paying people underneath the legal minimum wage. So to hide that, they would restrict the freedom of movement of these workers. They'd take away their passports. They would tell them they couldn't go into the local town. They would start locking them in and these sorts of things. So to reduce the risks of being discovered for having illegal practices, they got into even more illegal practices. And we can see this playing out in COVID times as well, where many companies have carried on working despite they're supposed to have stopped during the pandemic. And to hide that, they've restricted the freedom of movement of their workers. They've locked them in, they've kept them stuck in dormitories and other sorts of things to prevent their illegal practices, their lack of protection, health protections from being discovered. So these are kind of some of the kind of innovations that tend to be used. And I'll talk about one more. If we look at the workers as consumers one, so this is intermediaries. These are people who are agents who find workers for other companies. And what we found that, say, in the agriculture industry in the UK, that rather strangely, you expect people in modern slavery to be worked to the bone, right? For people that operate them to want to get as much work for as little money as possible. Of course they would, right? That's how the rationality of this works. But that's not what we found necessarily. There were cases where agents would get control of workers and rather than giving them lots and lots and lots of work to do, would not give them very much work to do. They were underworked. They were giving them less work than they wanted to do. How is that possible that somebody in forced labour is get less work than they want to do? So what we discovered though was that these people were under the control of these agents who would find other ways of generating revenue from them. So by charging them for their accommodation, charging them for their food and transport, overcharging them because they weren't letting them go away, they weren't letting them out, they didn't have any options for where they lived, they didn't have any options for where they got their food from. And so they would overcharge them on all these things and generate revenue in that way. So the more workers you have under your control, as long as you don't give them too much work to do, they're never going to make enough money. You keep charging them lots more money, and so they go into debt with you more and more. They have to get money sent over from overseas, or they have to then resort to more and more desperate practices to pay off their debts. So these are how the economics of control work, right? They're not just simple cost-benefit analysis, you get more work out of the worker. Sometimes you're doing these types of practices to have greater protection of your business in terms of reducing your risk. Sometimes it's about generating revenue from your workers, almost acting as if they're consumers of your services rather than just workers who you're deploying into productive employment. So that's just a flavour of some of the things that we found. And so we can talk about more perhaps if we have time in the Q&A, but one of the key things here then is to think about, okay, so if this is how these modern slavery enterprises are operating at the end of the supply chain, at the bottom of the supply chain, how would that then relate to what's happening with multinational corporations? How we like to think of this is to say, well, the multinational companies, the business models of those companies drive these changes, these innovations in the business models of modern slavery enterprises. There's a reason why they engage in these practices, and often it's because of what happens further down the supply chain, right? The kind of the cost cutting, the restriction of margins, the imposition of very high flexibility. That kind of business model creates the conditions under which these modern slavery enterprises change the way they operate. And likewise, when they change how they operate, that then enables these multinational business models, right? That it's by doing these things, by keeping workers under their control, by making it possible for them to make money despite the fact that there's really not enough money coming down the supply chain, they manage to survive and prosper by engaging in this more illegal activity. So that's basically how we understand this relationship between the modern slavery enterprises and their business models and the business models of multinational companies. So just for a few minutes now, I just want to take you then onto the question of COVID now and how this has kind of changed things. And I'm going to just tell you a couple of insights from two very recent research projects that have happened, not my projects, but ones that have been completed by other researchers in this area that I thought might be interesting to bring to the discussion. And so one of these was commissioned by the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, where they commissioned 5 studies in India and Bangladesh. And I'll tell you a little bit about them in a moment, but basically what they summarize is the research revealed that devastating consequences of the pandemic across all sectors, right? If things were bad before, they've become much, much, much worse now for workers who are vulnerable to modern slavery. Then another study conducted by Sheffield University and the Workers' Rights Consortium out of the US did a big survey of over 1,100 garment workers across 4 countries, Ethiopia, Honduras, India, and Myanmar. And what they found were deteriorating living and working conditions for workers in garment supply chains, including what they call a surge in vulnerability to forced labour amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. A little bit of detail on both of these. So the ones from the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, here's just some things they found. So in the apparel or clothing industry, and this has been well documented elsewhere, that many companies, multinational companies, cancelled their orders when the pandemic hit because nobody was buying their clothes as much. Many of the suppliers weren't paid by multinationals, and the suppliers themselves didn't pay their workers, which led to more insecurity for the workers, and also for those that did carry on working, lack of health protection. And in one of their studies, 94% of the factory workers they surveyed in Bangladesh had taken on debt. 95% were suffering from food insecurity, and 11% of the workers were under the age of 14. This was, after the onset of the pandemic. In the construction industry, they looked at in India, 65% of construction workers in Delhi who participated in the study and reported losing their jobs due to the pandemic. And then they also looked at migrant workers, so the kind of labor recruitment industry. And what they found there was that so migrant workers from India and Bangladesh who would normally be working in the Gulf, all of those were forced, many of them were forced to come back to repatriate, but without money, still owing debts from having gone out there, and were therefore forced into deeper debt bondage. And then on the Sheffield study, a couple of charts from there. This was their findings on indicators of forced labour during the pandemic. And all of these apparently had increased since the onset of the pandemic largely. And these are indicators, together, some of these would constitute forced labour. Any one on its own would not. But by breaking it down into indicators, you get more of a sense of the sorts of things that are happening, which includes things such as lack of personal protection equipment, so lack of proper health protection during the pandemic, verbal abuse, threats, intimidation, etc., as well as large amounts of unfair wage deductions, restrictions for water and toilet breaks and those sorts of things, false promises, physical abuse, the standard list of exploitative practices. And then, the kind of effects of this, so people either expected to do more work and not being paid for it, or having less work to do and working in more exploitative situations. In each of the 4 countries they looked at, there'd been an increase in the average debt of workers, right? And this is most pronounced in Ethiopia, as you can see, but this is in US dollars. Purchasing parity. And as you can see, significant changes in many countries in terms of the amount of debt that's held, which, as we all know, is a precursor to people being vulnerable to being in debt bondage and forced labour type of conditions. because the more debt that you have, you often then have to sell what it is that you have, which is your future labor. And so that is the way in which many people get stuck then into debt bondage situations. And so what was the result? What was the response of companies to this, of multinationals? And the Sheffield study summarized this way. They said that this risk of workers falling into modern slavery has been exacerbated, been made worse by the response of retail companies. And there's little evidence that most have acted in line with their social responsibilities to support their supply chain workers, despite many of them accessing pandemic recovery funds. So they took money from the government to protect themselves, but most of that did not end up in the supply chain for the workers. So a couple of words of conclusion then. I mean, the first thing to note here really is that the business models underpinning modern slavery are diverse and evolving. We shouldn't just assume it's all just about saving money. That when you're at the bottom of the supply chain, when you're at the real kind of cutting edge of where this happens, there's various ways in which firms will try, or even individuals sometimes will try and make some money, sometimes just a little bit of money, sometimes a lot, but it depends, because they're often on the fringes. They've got very low margins. They're often, all the value is being captured somewhere else in the supply chain. And so they innovate the way in which they can make money in these business models. So we shouldn't assume that there's just a simple way in which they're operating. And secondly, COVID-19 has had these very unequal effects on workers at the bottom of the supply chain. Those are the ones that have suffered the most, right? They're the most vulnerable, and they've really suffered the most extreme effects of what's been happening. And the response of brands to this has been limited, but I would argue for good reason. And the good reason is this: worker vulnerability is essentially a design feature of the business models of multinationals. It's deliberate that issues such as flexibility are pushed down the supply chain. Multinationals don't want the responsibility of looking after workers. That's why they outsource their products. They outsource the production of their products far down the supply chain because they don't want the costs of protecting those workers. And so vulnerability is built into the business models that they have. And so it's not an accident that this is happening, but it's a very predictable consequence of the situation we find ourselves in. So that's all from me. I very much appreciate your questions or thoughts or reflections, and also your experiences that you may have from your own context as well on this important issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the presentation. And I apologize for the connection issues that we had at the beginning again.
No problem.
Your presentation really gave us a broad overview of the modern slavery in the actual context in the world. And it raised me some questions, mainly related to the supply chain management in order to prevent this kind of human rights violations. But before that, I would like to invite our debaters, Thais and Carolina, to present their reflections too.
Thais, do you want to start or shall I? Okay, then I think I can start. So for me, it was brilliant because you touched a point that for me seems very interesting. So how legal and illegal things are correlated. And we have seen so in many domains. So for example, illegal goods are a kind of modern slavery also that we see also attached to another things such as agriculture and all those things. And sometimes I keep thinking, what's the role that big corporations play in this mechanic? But for example, I was Googling here, what do I need to do if I want to announce a global slavery position here in LinkedIn? And I have seen that LinkedIn doesn't ask me for any documentation, neither any compliance, anything to announce something there. So I would like also to ask you, what's the mechanic there? Are they recruiting people from somewhere else, or are they so working with business model with nationals? Are they bringing so people from across borders? Because that's something we see here in Brazil. Indeed, we see lots of human trafficking, really, to come and join those forced laborers, farmers, or something like that. So that's a point I would like also to hear from you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the kind of international recruitment practices are absolutely essential to this. I mean, most workers who end up in this situation, a very large proportion of them are migrant workers. And sometimes those are international migrants and sometimes domestic migrants. So with domestic migrants, they may be people that have come from the countryside to the city. If they're international, they come typically from a poorer country to a richer country. And that's usually the case. And migrants are vulnerable. They're more vulnerable than anybody else in many ways because of language. They lack the kind of infrastructure of protection where they go to, and sometimes they're also illegal where they're working, right? And so they may, or sometimes they think they are even if they're not, so they lack any kind of obvious legal protections. Now, multinationals typically do not get involved directly in this kind of illegal recruitment that might happen, but sometimes they're involved in taking advantage of it. But it's very hard for them to know sometimes, right? So when we were doing our work, we realized that you could have a retailer that is selling food in Brazil or in the UK, and it's selling, I don't know, onions or potatoes or something, which come from the same country. No big complicated supply chain. They know exactly the farm where they're coming from. And they probably audit this farm fairly regularly, make sure that it has good practices. Why do they miss? How come that farm is discovered sometimes of having modern slavery? And it's because of the way in which so much work now is done by these kind of part-time, temporary agency workers. And the multinational never knows who is working on that farm at any time, because even the farmer doesn't know who's working on the farm. The farmer doesn't employ the people. The farmer gets an agency to find the workers it needs for the potato harvest. And that agency doesn't have enough workers, so they outsource to other recruiters who find some other workers, and then they do it and they find some others, and then they recruit from other agencies, and it goes like that until it gets into somebody who's operating as a more informal agent, perhaps an illegal agent who is operating a very unethical business and may well be, exploiting the workers to a much higher degree. And sometimes it's somebody, say in the UK, we might have a situation where somebody from Eastern Europe would be very common. And you may have an agent who's also from that country who brings in a group of workers from overseas because they know there's going to be some work with the potato harvest next week. They bring them in, but in a way that they've told them there's going to be a long job for them, lots of great work, full-time, permanent, well-paid work, and there's not when they get there, right? There's just this terrible conditions. There's this short-term work, and so they're already in debt in terms of having got there, and then they get control of them in this way, and then they carry on then operating them, having control over them. So for the multinationals, they don't often have good oversight on what's happening because of the complexities of the recruitment industry in many industries. But it's because they want this flexibility, right? Flexibility is built into the system, whether it's food or clothing or anything else or electronics. They want to be able to say, yeah, we need this many computers next week. We want this many t-shirts tomorrow. We want this many potatoes now. And that flexibility should be very costly, but they're not willing to pay the cost. And so the cost gets pushed out down the supply chain of all these agents, and there's just not enough value in the supply chain for everyone to take what they need from it. And that's when the bad practices enter it.
And that's very important, because when we start, for example, to talk about modern slavery and everything, I always think the way that we are cyber integrated there. Because, for example, there was, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, a decision in California Supreme Court that said no immunity for Facebook, who were letting so people be elicited for sex trafficking here. So you should have had your team there to identify what are the red flags here. You haven't done that. People have reported that to you, haven't done that. And you need to have somehow a database that you don't let, for example, corporations that were already blacklisted somewhere to create a profile and announce on your platform. And that's super important, because I also Googled here. So Brazil has one of those blacklisted models, but it's something that it's really hard to reach. I tried to Google that. I myself in Portuguese, I couldn't find it. So you see that there's a list somehow, somewhere, but you cannot find it really. So there is also, in the missing of data, this lack of data overall, an excuse also for corporations, big corporations or whatever, to keep with those practices also, because it's super important when you say, okay, we are moving, so even if domestically, so employees from São Paulo to the countryside, but how do they meet each other, first of all, you know? And we are very aware of, for example, Facebook situation. They are moving people so across borders and everything. And the security teams there, they seem to say it's not our problem because we don't know what is happening. So after all there, so we only see the recruitment. We don't know what the end of this thing is. So something that I see also as very important is to start forming these databases. We see so numbers, countries, but we don't see, for example, corporations names there. And something just like the World Bank does, we do have that for corruption, for another kind of financial practice. Maybe it would be also a good solution for modern slavery. So I'd also like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because it's very often not the multinational that's involved in the actual act of slavery, even though it's in their supply chain. And so giving them, trying to impose criminal liability can be problematic, because criminal liability tends to presuppose that this is a deliberate behavior. And with corruption, it is, right? You've paid the money, and so you can say that you've done it. With it, something that happens through your supply chain, it's much more difficult. And so where the legislation tends to be moving at the moment is towards things such as human rights due diligence, right? So forcing firms, so making it mandatory, they have to at least evaluate their human rights risks in their supply chain and then manage them effectively. That sort of legislation is starting to be introduced now in Europe. And so we can see it kind of building momentum now. So I think that's likely where things are going to go for the time being, rather than criminal liability. They'll have liability, but for having put in place an effective due diligence process before they do something. But even that is incredibly complicated actually for a company, right? Any decision it makes, it should check out whether there's going to be a human rights impact to it. That's a lot of work. So it's going to be interesting to see how well that is implemented. But I think it's a good step forward towards what you're talking about. It's probably the next step.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Thais, do you want to comment something?
Yes, thank you. First, I want to thank you, organizers, and Professor Eduardo, for this debate opportunity. And also thank you, Professor Crane, for the brilliant explanation. It's an honor to be here today, learning and discussing these relevant topics. And I was thinking about the whole of the private sector in this issue. we talk about legislations that maybe legislation maybe enforce some kind of due diligence and compliance, but I would like to hear from you, Professor, some considerations about the engagement of the companies. For example, we heard recently Nestlé, a big food industry, announced that they will plant 1 million native trees in Atlantic forest here in Brazil, under the pretext of taking care of the planet for our child. But in the same time, in Brazil alone, there are thousands of children and teenagers in poor conditions in cocoa farms, working for Nestlé by the supply chain. So what can be done for companies to real value life and take care of their production chain, instead of mere marketing moves and apparent legitimation, like I think this plant of 1 million trees can be?
Yeah, it's a good question, Thais. You know, multinational food companies have known about slavery in the cocoa supply chain for decades, and they've committed to fixing the issue for decades. And the most recent evidence, I don't know about Brazil, but the most recent evidence from West Africa, from Ghana and the Ivory Coast, is the problem has got worse, not better, during the last 20 years. Right? During the time they've had these commitments to eradicate it, the problem has got worse, not better. So, you know, what is happening there? I mean, the problem is, unless there's enough pressure on companies to change things, they won't. Right? And they've always got pilot projects. They've always got something going on. They've always got some nice initiative that often they're quite well designed initiatives that would have a meaningful impact. So in the cocoa industry, they've been doing things such as, you know, rather than just doing auditing and these kind of things, they've been working with local farmers on improving their yields, on ensuring that farmers have good education, that their children get education, that there are appropriate schools, these sorts of things. So thinking of a more systemic solution. And systemic solutions are so important to these problems, right? You can't just get rid of slavery very easily. It's a complicated issue because it's driven by things such as high levels of poverty, discrimination, all these kind of things in particular areas. So systemic solutions are good, but systemic solutions have to be big, right? They can't just be pilot projects because that's never going to solve the problem. And so we've had this years and years and years of pilot projects without them actually going big and saying, okay, we're going to commit as much money as it takes to solving this problem. And I agree with you, these end up being marketing solutions to the fundamental problems. There are companies that are trying harder, I think, even in the cocoa industry, to deal with this. Often it involves being very close to your suppliers, which, when you can have direct oversight, when you have direct involvement with them, you're sharing the amount of money you make from your chocolate bars with them rather than extracting all the value. Then it becomes possible. But that requires major commitment, and it's quite difficult to do when you're large, right? Because having those relationships with suppliers when you're such a big company is much more difficult to achieve. So I can understand why it's happening, but at the same time, it's just going to carry on being a non-solution to the problem. So I think we have to force them more to tackle it. Carolina, you have your hand up.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to insist on a point I have mentioned about the criminalization. I and of the same side of the discussion, I also think, so for example, that criminalization may be a even worse issue because companies, they start to hide things in a more strong way than they were already doing. But also the due diligence panic is also a problem because the company cannot work properly. We have to measure everything. So we lost sometimes times doing so things that are not very useful for our business and neither solve the problem. Also something that I see as very interesting for you to see into this compliance and everything is how many times, for example, we have companies that they have all the compliance requirements and everything, but still so they have problems of human rights there. So because we all know that those companies, what they are going to do is just like criminals, they are going to read the law and design the program in a way that you can somehow go outside. So for me, it's very interesting, this mechanic, because we have so law that comes there and say, okay, you are certified, so we don't need to worry about you. But in fact, that gives us a false negative. And it's also something that I see as a hidden data. We don't see lots of people talking about it. So if you are certified, then okay, you can pass. So that's also something I would like to hear from you, what the state of art is in this behalf.
Yeah, I mean, the whole compliance problem, yeah, it's what companies like to do generally around this issue is to show that they have a system that is designed to solve the problem. And as long as they've got a system that's designed to solve the problem, they're kind of protected. I think the problem often is that a system that's designed to show that you're dealing with the problem rather than a system that actually deals with the problem is a very different thing. And so this is where this the whole kind of social audit model kind of falls down, because lots of companies audit their supply chains. You know, the good companies, the better companies audit their supply chains all the time. But the improvements in working conditions have been minimal as a result of all of this. There have been some improvements, but overall, given the amount of time and effort and money that's been put into auditing, it hasn't shown much improvements in working conditions. But it has given companies a reasonable response to criticisms. It's not our fault. Look, we send the auditors there, they come up with things, we deal with it. If they don't find it, it's not our fault. And then it just takes a journalist or an NGO or an academic 10 minutes and they find it, right? Immediately. And it's not difficult. It's not difficult. And we know we know now after 25 years of research what makes for good audits. We know. And some companies are doing good audits, but many of them are not. They're just doing the basics to give them a good enough story to account for what they're doing. But it's not rocket science. We know that if they're unannounced, if they're properly trained, if they're in the right language, if they interview workers outside of the workplace, all these things, we know that's much better identifying these problems than the type that tend to be engaged with. So, we know many of the answers. It's just that companies haven't felt the need to implement them because doing enough is solving the reputational problem that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also miss a lack of training, I see. So I cannot think about people organized in a meeting discussing human slavery in a great company. I have never seen that. That's also a point to start to discussing things thoroughly. So what's the problem in Brazil with human trafficking and everything slavery in agriculture? Then bring the people who are in the agriculture to put them to be trained. So as such, but something that even if we see internationally, we don't see lots of people together in a meeting in a place discussing that, the summits, I would say. So for me, it seems weird, because at the time we start just claiming things, it's important, but when we see there's no huge, big multinational organizing anything, no one is talking about that. So we are already here and there, but people, they are really, okay, as long as we are compliant with the requirements here, the certification, it's okay. So the thing does not evolve further. Yeah, that's a reason of worry for me at least.
Yeah, yeah, and there are some people in multinationals who are very knowledgeable and experienced about these issues. They work in the sustainability team or in the CSR team, the corporate social responsibility team, or they work in ethical compliance. The problem is they're not involved in many of the discussions typically on procurement, on purchasing, on supply chain management. And you know, one of the things that came out of one of the studies I presented to you on the COVID response was that the CSR people were saying, you know, the social responsibility people were saying, we weren't in the room when the decisions on how to deal with COVID were taken, right? They don't ask us. So the people that know about these things, that know about human rights, the experts, they're not involved in the decisions often. And so the companies that are really leading on this, they have proper integration, but it's rare.
Professor, if I can add a point, because I think it's very related to what Carolina just asked about criminalization. When we think about it, specifically the legal initiatives to criminalize the modern slavery, human trafficking, and other gross human rights violations, and I think specifically about criminal law because in my research, I am also investigating to what extent the direct intervention of criminal law helps in solving problems. But when I see the legal initiatives, it seems to me that in generally, they all require the bare minimum to comply with the law. So it doesn't actually require companies to take meaningful steps. It is a reporting obligation alone. So for many companies, they just write a paper, a basic statement, or just introduce lots of policies, procedures, which sound great on paper, but these policies don't equate into actual implementation. In the last webinars, we discussed about the mandatory human rights due diligence in Europe and the German Supply Chain Act, and we could understand the advance of conceiving the human rights due diligence as a binding obligation. But both of these initiatives have the same weak point of not directly involve the most distant parts of the supply chain. So that is a big paradox for me because the most serious violations that we have occur exactly at the bottom of the supply chain. So in your opinion, should we apply the criminal law to the bottom of the supply chains, precisely because that is the point of vulnerability that the company should be more aware of, or we should think of alternative strategies more related to business models and the kind of capitalism that we are providing? I think that's a question, but I would really like to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Victoria. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the ins and outs of how the law works on this necessarily. But my sense is that the political will for criminal liability for companies on human rights is low in most countries. So I'm a pragmatist at heart. So, you know, trying to get these things through can be problematic. That's not to say they couldn't be effective, but the likelihood of them happening is currently low, but things can change. But I see that one approach that I do think is quite interesting, I'm not quite sure what I feel about it, but the approach that has been taken very much in the United States more recently has been around trade bans, right? So the way they will ban the import of goods where they suspect there's been forced labor. And this idea, I think, is one that gets very much to the heart of how business works, right? You just stop goods entering the market. And the burden of proof is lower, right? You don't have to prove that there is forced labor. The companies have to prove that there isn't in able to import their products. And so that, I think that's an interesting way of trying to switch it around. So rather than trying to make them criminally liable for something in their supply chain, they have to prove that something in their supply chain is good, right? That there isn't slavery before they're even allowed to sell their products in the country. And so these sorts of approaches, I think, can be effective. I think they're a little bit blunt, right? They're not the most sophisticated, and they sometimes can have some unintended consequences because of that. They also are at risk of, international geopolitics, right? So we know currently there's a big problem in China, in the Northwest, in Xinjiang, with the Uyghur people being involved in forced labor. That has proved much more difficult for countries to impose import bans because they're so reliant on China for various other products and for many things. And so it raises some additional problems, these kind of bans. But I think that there are alternative ways of thinking about this. And the most limited legislation is that which focuses on transparency in supply chains, like the UK has and has been introduced in Australia and California as well. This is a very, very limited legislative approach. Human rights due diligence goes a bit further, but as you say, has some weaknesses. Trade bans, they're pretty strong, quite effective. But there are other things that you can do too. I mean, the way in which labour providers, so intermediaries, agents, are licensed can have a big effect. So if you license them and enforce that licensing, you can help to squeeze out some of the informal or illegal operators. And lots of companies don't have much enforcement of labour providers, for example. So there are different ways of getting at this problem. So in the UK with labour providers, for example, there is licensing, but licensing isn't the issue. It's the enforcement that matters. And there's a very strong enforcement body now. There wasn't before. Before there was just strong enforcement in the food industry. Now it's been expanded. And if you can resource the enforcement well enough, you can drive out a lot of the bad businesses. But it takes political will, it takes resources, and it takes attention to the issue. But sometimes those sorts of approaches, right, a more positive thing like licensing and enforcement of licensing, rather than the negative, like criminal liability, is sometimes easier to push through politically. But it also depends on your government and what's likely to happen in Brazil at the moment. Are you going to get criminal liability? Not at the moment, but if things change, who knows?
Thank you so much, Professor. You raised very interesting points and certainly raised me some reflections. And I would like to ask if we have a minute for a last question.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor, for such an insightful presentation. And thank you also to our debaters for such an insightful debate as well. Professor, something that I wanted to ask you about your last research that you have also presented here today in your presentation is about the global business of forced labor and the perspective that you have called as risk reduction. So risk reduction of being caught by enacting or perpetrating a hidden crime. Something that I was thinking before our meeting is that we also face that in Brazil. For example, here, our labor inspectors and our NGOs have discovered 3 years ago, I think, that there are some practices like agribusiness and also organized crime in Brazil that use forced labor to deforestate the Amazon rainforest. So I think, if I may, this is a little bit harder than the UK perspective, because we use a hidden crime to promote a hidden crime in order to promote an increase in profitability for businesses that operate in the region. So I think these convergences of crimes turn it even harder to promote detection of these crimes. So I would ask you, what do you think we can have as a better framework for crime detection in UK or also for Brazil? As you also highlight in the text that you have wrote, these are hidden crimes, and the budget to provide for labor inspectors is also very low. So what do you think would be a better framework for crime and other offenses detection in UK and Brazil in this comparative perspective? Thank you very much again, Professor.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's a great question. It's a difficult one to answer in many ways. It's Brazil has a pretty good record of investigating exploitation, and they have some interesting approaches going on using big data and other sorts of things in terms of criminal investigations. And I think that the more we get different types of data to try and investigate these crimes, I think is one way of going about it. So rather than thinking about it just in terms of waiting for somebody to report this, I think we can find it other ways, right? Sometimes by following financial flows is one way. And this kind of follow the money type of approach that some countries now use on kind of different criminal activities. It happened a lot with organized crime, which has some overlaps with modern slavery practices. And you can see it also with illegal or informal operators. You can start to identify them through financial flows that are happening where they shouldn't be happening, right? You can work out if somebody's operating a business by their financial flows, even if they're not registered as a business. So these can be the different kinds of ways, the more indirect ways to try and work out what's going on, that I think can be very helpful. I mean, other ways, I was talking to somebody recently in Hong Kong who their approach to identifying this is to set up, is to support migrant workers. And to support the migrant workers, what they do is they set up Facebook groups for them and get the workers to tell them things with direct messages. So they have groups that help support them, but they build relationships with them then and get the migrant workers to tell them about unethical practices that are happening. And then they use that data to then investigate who are likely to be the kind of labor market intermediaries, the kind of agencies and what have you, who are operating in an illegal way. So there's different kinds of data points that you can use, right? Whether it's social media data, whether it's financial data. Other people are using, I know in Brazil, they're using other kinds of kind of regional data on physical location of different enterprises and employment rates and taxation and all that kind of thing, and trying to put the data together to find out what's happening on the ground, and so you can discover these spaces, right, where nothing formal is registered but stuff is happening. And I think if you put enough data together, you can start to do that. I can't do that, but people who are these data experts can really do it. And so I think there's some interesting ways forward that are starting to happen here with both criminal investigation as well as doing research around these topics using forms of big data and big data analysis that can be quite interesting.
So if we don't have any other questions from the participants, let me check. So yes, I think this is the last one. And in the name of the Business and Human Rights Working Group, I would like to thank you very much, Professor Andrew, our debaters, Thais and Carolina, and all of our participants. We had here a very special panel with a great discussion concerning modern slavery that certainly will improve our understanding of ways to prevent human rights violations in the corporate field. So if you all agree, possible questions from our participants or even by those who are going to watch later on YouTube will be gathered by our team and addressed later by email. I just want to mention that we have a series of webinars going on, and we look forward to have all of you there too. And our last webinars are all available in our channel on YouTube. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you all again one day.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.